A sneak peek from this week's episode. We talk about this a lot. When you're traveling, make sure you pack plenty of patience, because when you run into these delays, it's going to be very frustrating. And we saw a lot of people who figured that out, because we're sitting there in this airport and, we don't know who to call. I'm Scott.
And I'm Melissa.
And we are the Sunshine Travelers. Our passion is travel and sharing our experiences with those who enjoy it as much as we do, or those who want to learn more about travel, or even those that just want to live vicariously through our travel stories. No matter where you fall along that journey, get ready to hear about our first-hand experiences as we visit some of the most interesting and amazing places on Earth. This week we are going to talk about a part of travel that seems to be almost inevitable if you travel enough. We're going to discuss travel disruptions and what we do when those disruptions happen. There's an old saying, when life hands you lemons, make lemonade. The same can be said about disrupted travel, either through missed connections, canceled flights, or just overall changes in plans. Some of our most memorable experiences have come from travel disruptions, and we're going to share a few of those stories today, along with some tips and techniques to help you be prepared when those disruptions occur. So pack a bag, a little patience, and an open mind for adventure, and let's get started. Melissa, one of your favorite travel stories comes from a disruption that you experienced when we were in France, and I had to leave you at the airport to continue on to a meeting that I was attending for work.
Yeah, and I think that was probably my first time when I really had some kind of travel disruption, especially by myself, and it was just completely unexpected. You dropped me off. I went in to check my bags, and I had put my stuff through with the customs things that I had bought, and turned all that in, turned all my receipts in, and went to check my bags for the flight. And the person at the ticket counter was just like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Here's your vouchers. Your flight's leaving at 8 a.m. tomorrow." And this was noon on a Sunday. And, here's your hotel, and here's your meal tickets and all that stuff. And I was just kind of in shock. That was just completely unexpected. Sometimes you might know because of weather or, something, you get a notification. I was just completely in shock. So I think I just called you and was like, "Oh, what am I going to do?" And we were in Paris, and you were like, "Oh, well, I guess you could go back into, Paris for the day." But I don't know. It was January. It was kind of cold. And I was just like, "Oh, I don't," it wasn't it was beautiful out and wanting to go outside. And so you were so sweet, and you were just like, "Well, why don't you go to Disneyland Paris? Wouldn't that be so cool?" And I guess we had seen the signs, right? You'd seen the signs, and we'd seen the signs in the airport. And so I just, actually gone to the hotel, dropped everything off because I was actually taking a bunch of your stuff back. And so I just went to the Disney counter and bought the ticket for the afternoon, and they had a bus that actually took you there. And so that was just a neat, very unexpected, way to spend the afternoon, and just being able to walk around and see Disneyland Paris. And I think it closed at 8:00, and the train station was right there. And so then I just, walked around and saw everything, and then just grabbed a ticket on the train and headed back to the hotel. And I guess it would have been a lot more frustrating if it was okay, you had to, thankfully we didn't have anything that we really had to organize with work schedule or kids and, our pets. I think it was just one of those things where it was okay, they were very easily taken care of. So I think it would have been, if that had been more of a hassle, it would have been a lot harder, but yeah.
Yeah, I had really just kind of mentioned that half jokingly, but of course, Melissa was like, "Oh yeah, I could do that." And, figured it out and went and visited. And even today you still talk about, all the hearing the songs and stuff like that in French, and how that made an impression on you. And
oh yeah, the parade went by, and it was in, it was just everything was in French. And I stayed for the fireworks show. I just remember it, the park closed a lot earlier than it would, say in Florida, and probably even in California. And they had the fireworks show, and then it just closed immediately. So, I mean, I mainly just spent the time walking around, just kind of seeing the differences between Disney World and that, and just kind of soaking it in. But yeah, that's funny that you say you were half kidding, because I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm going to do this." So I think the biggest tip I would have for, travel disruptions, because it's, it can be oh my gosh, what's going to happen, what's going to do, is that I think it just forces you to be creative and just figure things out. And then so I think just okay, take a deep breath. And how can we turn this inconvenience or, whatever? And we're going to give some more examples, but into something like you mentioned at the beginning, like into something where, okay, this became a memorable experience. So I think if you can just kind of get past that, you learn a lot from, okay, how do we handle this situation? And if you're traveling with children, like I think it would be a great teaching opportunity too, just for like flexibility and how do we problem solve and things like that.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of leads us into the next story that we're going to talk about is just earlier this year, we were in Slovakia and I had meetings in Slovakia and then I had meetings after that in the UK, but there was a weekend in between. And so, our plan is that we were going to go to Belgium and spend the weekend in Belgium. But, it just didn't turn out that way because we had a very short amount of layover when we got back to Heathrow. And so, we knew that with having to check our luggage and what we had heard from people that the luggage was very slow in Heathrow and stuff like that. And knowing that we had to clear customs and we had to go back through security, we just really were worried even to begin with. But then when we got through all that, got to the gate or ready to go into the gates, I guess I should say, we scanned our tickets and they were like, nope, you're not allowed. Even though the flight hadn't left yet, it was too soon before they closed the gates. And so they wouldn't let us go through and get on that flight.
Yeah, having to be through that security checkpoint in a certain amount of time. So
yeah, not like in the US where you can kind of go skidding up to the gate at the last second. They actually checked the amount of time at that security gate when you scanned your ticket.
Yeah, and they even called. It was pretty late, and so there weren't nobody like in the security checkpoint. There's nobody in the. We were actually flying British Airways, and so we talked to them, and he called back there, and it was just like, no, they're not going to be able to. They're not going to be able to get through in time. So yeah. So what would you say that we gained from that experience?
Well, actually, we talked about it, and we said, do we want to just catch the next flight out in the morning? And because that was the last flight of the day, we talked about maybe taking a train. We talked about a couple of different options, but then it was like, well, we're just not going to have much time once we get there. Like we needed that flight to work. And so when it didn't work out, we then turned and said, okay, what could we do instead? And I remember going to the ticket agent and I was like, where else could we fly tonight? And of course, I don't think he was a ticket agent. I think he was just a baggage handler or something. And he was like, I don't know. He's like, I don't know where you could go. But and this was one of the problems with us not having status with British Airways. We had nobody to call. And you called a number and no one picked up. It just rang and rang and rang and rang. And so, this is where things like if this happened and we were flying on Delta, we would call the medallion line and we would get, either straight through to an agent or, we'd be put into a shorter queue and have somebody who could help us figure this out and maybe say, oh, well, look, there's a flight going to Denmark or something like that, right? Somewhere else that we've never been before. And we could have gotten on that, but because we couldn't reach anyone, we just really had to step back and say, all right, we're frustrated.
We were hungry.
Yeah, we were hangry, but we were also frustrated because we really wanted to do this trip. And we needed that time to just kind of gripe and complain a little bit, right?
Yeah.
About that. And then once we got that out of our system, then we stepped back and said, okay, so what are we going to do?
Yeah. And I think in most cases, it's like you said, I think most cases you would say, okay, we can stay somewhere close. We're going to get on the flight the next day because that's what he said. Can we rebook you for tomorrow? But in this particular case, it was Friday night and we were going to spend all day Saturday there. And then we had a fairly early flight coming back Sunday for just something that we already had planned on Sunday. So it just really didn't make sense. Like it felt like a lot of waste of time. But in most cases, it would be like, okay, now book us on the next flight. Now we'll just get a hotel room and we'll figure this out. We'll go tomorrow. But yeah, that's true. In this case, it was something that we were adding and then coming back to London Heathrow as well. So
this is when we just kind of made the game time decision and said, Let's stay in London. Although we've spent a lot of time in London, there were still things that we had never done before. You know, one of the things that we ended up doing, it's something we've done before, but we just enjoyed. We went and rode bikes in Hyde Park that morning, got a cup of coffee, rode bikes for a little bit, went down to the palace because we had heard through a blogger that the flags were up for the coronation and stuff like that.
But they weren't. Not yet.
Yeah,
they weren't. But that's okay. But yeah, I mean, anytime you can go down through Hyde Park and Green Park and down to Buckingham Palace and, everybody who's down there seeing it for the first time. Yeah, so we just kind of made our way slowly. And then I had seen something probably, I think in the hotel room or something, one of the magazines about Hampton Court Palace. And I was like, oh, that would be really neat. They were having a tulip festival. So it was the palace and the grounds. And it was like, oh, this would be really neat. It's not far outside of London, but it was not something I think we talked about it on London episode, but it's not something you would do as a first timer, but it's actually very beautiful and very historical and very well done. So it gave us, something new to do in London.
Yeah, I think it actually kind of ranks up there on some of our most favorite things that we've done in London or in and around London. So, and we would recommend it to anyone to go and visit Hampton Court Palace, but we had never done so before ourselves. And so,
right. Yeah. And I think that the other thing is, the other things that we learned from this were having our travel loyalty. So like we had planned to stay at like a Marriott based hotel in Brussels. And so then just calling because it was past the cancellation time, right? Because it was like already past check-in. And so I called them and said, okay, here's what happened. Like, can you help us? Because hoping that if we could rebook something in London, and they could work that out. And sure enough, they were like, oh, we'll waive the cancellation fees and you won't have to pay anything. And then helped us find something close by that would work for the weekend because you already had something booked for the other time that we were going to be there. So that helped too, having that loyalty as well. But then also, I think in hindsight, learning how would you handle things like this for if you have travel insurance or if you have a credit card that covers trip disruptions and trip cancellations. So this one was a little interesting because it wasn't, illness or anything like that. It was actually a delay by the airline. And so just kind of knowing. So because we were on a different airline than British Airways, so it was Austrian, I believe, and that was a flight delay, is just knowing now in hindsight, like if you have those flight delays, figure out, I would say right then and there, how do you get a hold of the information that you need to prove that the flight was delayed, just so you could figure out how to do it later. Because I did, after we got home, I spent a lot of hours later trying to figure out, okay, how do I get this documentation? And I never got all of it that I needed, but, or then even going back to like British Airways, they did refund like part of the taxes and things like that. So I guess just kind of knowing going into it or asking those questions then, okay, what are the regulations? How do I get a hold of this documentation? Because it was very difficult. And like I mentioned, I was never able to get completely refunded for those flights, but everything else worked itself out.
And, we really had a good time as we stayed there in London. We did things that we'd never done before, like we went down to Carnaby Street in Soho. I got some fantastic pictures and did things like that. So
well, and the other thing that I remember from that after we left, so we took the train out to Hampton Court Palace, but on the way back, it's right there on the Thames. And so there was a boat, the last boat for the night, that was going to leave and go up the river a little bit. It was Thames River Cruises that went a little way there. And I was like, oh, Scott, let's see if we can do this real quick. And they, had a little bar on board and we got some cider and stuff like that. And so that was just it for me, like that was just a neat experience. And then we had to get off and, take the train the rest of the way to where we were going. And
then, of course, we had some fantastic Indian food.
We did. Yes.
That's just a great example of where things didn't turn out the way that we wanted them to, but it actually ended up being a great trip and probably allowed us to get a little more rest than trying to squeeze another country in, over just a short period of time. There's sometimes things happen and there's just nothing you can do about them. So earlier this year when we traveled to the Galapagos, we experienced a delay on our flight from Guayaquil, Ecuador, flying to the Galapagos. You have to basically there's two places, and we've talked about this in our episode. You could either go from Quito, Ecuador, or you could go from Guayaquil. And, people choose both of those for various reasons. We now know that we probably would have chosen Guayaquil just from the altitude, right? So we went way up in altitude to stay for a couple of days to go down to sea level. But, Quito was something that I'd wanted to do. I'd wanted to go to see the Gilded Churches. I'd been there for work and really just saw hotel room, office, restaurant, that type of thing.
And we got to go to the equator.
Yep, we went to the equator. But anyhow, you had to fly from Quito to Guayaquil and then Guayaquil to the Galapagos. And so as our plane was taking off from Guayaquil, we hit a bird. So a bird went through the engine and blew out the engine, and they had to abort the takeoff. And so, that put a delay into our travel. Well, that's a big deal because the reason that we needed to be in Ecuador ahead of time was so that we didn't miss the boat going out on the trip. Luckily for us, the majority of the passengers on our boat were on that plane. And
I think it was all but 2 people, right?
Yeah.
I think all the rest of the 14.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, they weren't going to go anywhere without the passengers. And it did cause us to miss, I think, the first excursion day that they had. But overall, we got there later that afternoon. And, but you're sitting there in the airport. And this is where I mentioned that you need to pack patience. We talk about this a lot. When you're traveling, make sure you pack plenty of patience, because when you run into these delays, it's going to be very frustrating. And we saw a lot of people who figured that out, because we're sitting there in this airport and, we don't know who to call.
Well, and in this case, we should say, so we had to arrange ourselves to get to Quito, but then we booked everything else. So the travel agency that we used to book the cruise booked that part of the travel too. And so we hadn't booked these tickets. They just here's your tickets.
Yeah. And I think we had, one of the people that were traveling with us had reached out to that travel agency, but, they didn't get anyone, or they didn't know what was going on, right? So they needed some time to go and figure it out themselves. And so meanwhile, everybody's sitting here in this airport and they're wondering the same questions we are they going to miss their boat? And then if they miss the boat, how do they get onto it? So is the airline going to, shuttle us out to meet our boats? We had all these discussions that were going on. And then, and when things like this happen, often airlines will give you a voucher for some food or something like that because you're stuck here in a place. Well, this was a case where they put a line up, said that they were going to offer food vouchers. Everybody got in the line, and this thing was taking forever. It was taking 15, 20 minutes per voucher to be distributed. And then all these people waiting in line for an hour for the food vouchers, and they're like, "Oh, we're out of vouchers." And so, the people that were in the back of the line ended up not getting anything, from that. And so I imagine, very, very much frustration. But the good part is that the airline, I was concerned because it's just a little small, Ecuadorian airline, regional airline at that. And I was afraid that it would take them forever to get parts. Well, they're probably not going to rebuild a jet engine. So parts isn't an option here at this point. But, another plane out to us, do they have extra planes, right, that they could bring another one in? And the good news is that they did. And so I think we were, 3.5, 4 hours delayed, but they finally got the plane there. And we got on the plane and everybody's all nervous, is this thing going to happen again? And I remember when it lifted off the ground, everybody on the plane started cheering and clapping.
Yes, because you're right. Everybody was, well, probably almost everybody was going on a cruise. And so it was a delay, you've already kind of traveled for a couple of days and you're ready to do your cruise. But it's just interesting too. It was just a completely different experience than the one that I had when that flight was canceled. Like checking in and here you go and here's your vouchers and so it's just a different experience. But yeah, thankfully they were, okay, we've got to get these people where they're going. I mean, I have no idea even was there enough place for people to stay, not that when things happen like this, of course a lot of people just have to stay in airports and things like that. But yeah, we were fortunate that it worked out.
And also I think because the length of the trip was, as an extended trip already, losing half a day wasn't quite so noticeable as if maybe it was a 3-day trip, right? And you lose half a day on a 3-day trip. Well, that stings a lot. But things like that happen. And, that was what happened to us going to Belgium. It was a short trip. And so missing that flight really meant that it, was something that we weren't going to be able to do anymore.
Yeah. And so sometimes, so I guess our tip there is, well, it's like you mentioned in this case, they had us there in Quito by a certain amount of time so we could take this flight so we could get to the island on time, right? So that was already kind of built in. But then when that middle buffer, it's like, uh-oh, what happens? So just making sure when you do have, cruises or, certain things that you make sure you build in plenty of buffer time.
Yeah. So you and Carrie had an experience when you were going to Greece with Stephanie and Ed. Once again, I think I was working in London or outside London at that time. And so the two of you went and met Stephanie and Ed in Greece, and you guys had not a delay, but another travel disruption that happened.
Well, it was kind of a delay. So in this case, we're flying from Atlanta to Athens, Greece. And so the most logical way to do that is to go through like JFK, because then there's a direct flight from JFK to Athens. And so in this case, the flight out of Atlanta for weather probably or whatever kept getting delayed. And then so we weren't going to make that flight. We weren't getting to New York in time to make that flight. Now, we probably actually could have, but a lot of times the airlines, when you're doing that, like they make a decision and say, okay, we are going to put you on this other flight and try to at least get you there, because then if you miss that flight and we don't already have you rebooked. So I think even before we left Atlanta, they had rebooked us on a flight then through Frankfurt and then Frankfurt to Athens, which of course extends that a lot more. So unfortunately with that, we had to, like our bags didn't make it. Carrie and I finally, so we're waiting in Frankfurt like half a day, I think. We finally get to Athens and, we wait for our bags. And then we're the last people there. And then you come to the conclusion, okay, you know what? Our bags they're not coming. And we got to go talk to these people at the desk and all that good stuff. So, and also, I think that was my first time. So Carrie was doing a study abroad. She was in high school, but that was my first time, like, as a traveler, like traveling with one of my children, then where I've alone, like maybe without you, have to figure out, okay, what are we going to do, right? Because we were then supposed to get to, so we were half a day, 3/4 of a day delayed getting into Athens. We had already had ferry tickets. We were actually doing the island of Idra first and then coming back in a few days in Athens. So we had to like figure out, the ferries have already left. We've got to figure out, okay, where are we going to stay? So I think I went on booking.com and tried to just find something real quick and tried to look, okay, where, so that we can take that first ferry out. Stephanie and Ed were already over there. And, what are we going to do? So thankfully, my tips there were, and I've tried to stick with this since then, because I was very fortunate that I had packed things like electronic chargers, extra battery packs, toiletries, extra clothes, things like that in a carry-on bag so that we would have those things. And then just being able to like have my phone, on Wi-Fi to figure out where the hotel was. And I remember taking the bus to the hotel and just saying, okay, telling the driver, I don't know anything about, tell us when we're going to, this is where I'm going. Like, tell me when I need to get off, and just having to do those things. A lot of times when you travel, I'm not good about asking, you want to act like you fit in or, whatever, what you're doing. But in this case, it's like, okay, it's getting late. It's going to be dark. Saying to him, tell me when to get off. And he did. And then thankfully there were signs that told us how to get to this hotel. And the people were super nice. They actually went down to the ferry early in the morning and rebought our tickets. as well. And it actually turned out better that we didn't have those luggage because we went to Idra, which is like, there's no cars. It's like all cobblestone. You can either walk or ride donkeys. So as I mentioned in the last Greek episode, not doing your, rolling that suitcase, click, clack, click, click, clack, all the way up the thing. We just had like our backpack and stuff like that. And we had just told the airline, hey, this is where we're going to stay when we get back to Athens, because there's not going to be time for you to bring me this bag. And then I'm going to have this bag on this island and I'm already going to be left. And so they took it there, and we had to go buy a few things. So in that case, again, I think just knowing, like, we should have said to the airline, okay, well, we don't have our stuff. So like, what is your policy? Like, do you give us $50? Do you give us, because we did have to go buy a few like toiletry things. We also were going to go to the beach on the island. The only reason we even brought a bathing suit, I don't know why I didn't pack that in the carry-on. So we each had to go, like buy a swimsuit on the island. And so like just asking, okay, like what is your policy from the get-go to like buy these things, or how do I file for reimbursement? But a lot of times you just don't think about those things. So just kind of like having a checklist in your mind, because it's hard to kind of think clearly when you've got to then change all these plans.
And I know a lot of times now you'll actually either pack a change of clothes or a bathing suit, or depending on what we're doing, you'll put that into your carry-on if we're going to check a bag.
And that is why, because of that experience, but then also chargers and stuff too, because like, I really don't know that would have been very hard. I don't know what we would have done if I hadn't at least like packed those chargers and things like that. And I like to be able to, like wash your face and have your own toothbrush and, have your own things as well. So that would be my tip, is just like, okay, figuring that out. But the place that we were staying on Idra, like they were super nice. It was like a little small bed and breakfast, and we had planned to stay 2 nights. I had the reservation and she didn't charge me. We did have to rebuy those ferry tickets. So again, just asking the airlines, okay, like these are the things we have, like, do you reimburse for? Because it was, their fault, their delay. So. And
then we said we would talk about one last travel disruption that I ran into when I was traveling alone. I used to commute back and forth to New York every week. And it was at the time when our daughter was getting married. My boss may have encouraged me to leave earlier that week. And I was like, no, I've got some stuff I need to wrap up. I need to get done. It's no problem. I have plenty of time. And then when I get to the airport, it seemed like these thunderstorms came from nowhere. And there was a long line of thunderstorms that cut off the Northeast from the rest of the U.S. And all I saw was canceled. Every flight on the board canceled. And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Because I needed to get home for the wedding. And so that was a trip where I had to really think outside the box, and became a trip of planes, trains, and automobiles. So hopped in a taxi, took the taxi over to Penn Station, got on a train, took the train down below that line of thunderstorms into DC. And then from DC, I was able to catch another flight back to Atlanta. But I remember, really almost coming in on 2 wheels for, it wasn't so bad. It wasn't like I was just about to miss the wedding. It was the rehearsal, that night before. But, just being really worried, because I was sitting there thinking like, okay, if I can't get a flight into Atlanta, I'm going to have to drive. And I'm Googling how long will it take me to drive from New York to Atlanta. And it was like 16, 18 hours or something like that. And I was like, God, there's no way I could drive 16, 18 hours by myself. I'm straight through. So like, this is going to be 2 days. So like in my mind, everything kept coming back to, you're going to miss this. And so, but thankfully I was able to, get that flight rescheduled out of DC. Boy, everybody was fighting for those seats because they were running into the same problems. And matter of fact, when I get on the train, I'm just surrounded by people that I started recognizing that they were sitting in the airport as well. And so they had the same idea and they were doing the same thing that I was doing. But this is where I come into some of our tips and, techniques for dealing with travel delays and disruptions. You want to kind of dig into some of those, Melissa?
Yeah. So do you think, I'm sure you told your story like to the Delta to the Delta people? Like, do you think that had any bearing of like you got a seat versus somebody else like sooner or?
Maybe, I don't know, but one of the things that I would say is that this goes back to earlier. I talked about the value of the brand loyalty. I was able to get a hold of somebody. I mean, remember, every flight on that board delayed, right? Or canceled. It wasn't delayed, it was just canceled. So every one of those flights got canceled, and every one of those flights had people that needed to be rebooked on something. And so the lines in the airport were just all the way down the terminal trying to get in front of someone to talk to. Well, so I just said, screw it. I've got to figure this out on the fly. And so I'm talking to you in the taxi, and I'm like, okay, here's my plan of attack. Here's what I'm thinking. But then I immediately got on that, medallion line. I think at that time I was diamond medallion because I was flying so much. But, and so I got right on to somebody and I told them, here's the story. And so I did get on that flight out of DC. It wasn't the first flight. I did have to end up spending the night in DC or spending a few hours in a hotel or something like that. And then the next morning I took that flight out, but it got, really it got me into Atlanta just about an hour or so before the rehearsal.
I mean, so it must have been like later in the day because that was in the evening. So it wasn't like it was like right away. And so that's why I mentioned like if you've got something, a cruise or another connection or a wedding or something, just working yourself in some buffer time. I mean, I know there's times, recently when lots of the airlines just had some, major problems and there's just really nothing that you can do. But if you just have some buffer time and then, like you said, having that airport loyalty. And I think one of the things is maybe also having, like you were saying, you were calling me, just having somebody to just like complain to, like bounce it off of, but not taking it out on people at the airport or the airline employees or like, for example, like in London, when that happened to us, okay, that wasn't any of their fault. Like it wasn't even the same airline. There was just nothing you could do. Like you can't take it on the security people because like that's not their policy, right? They have those policies in place for a reason. So I guess just like you're saying, be patient and like, just pack your kindness and just don't take it out on the wrong people. But if you have somebody back home or just somebody like, okay, let me get this off my chest and maybe you can help me in a calmer state of mind, help me to think through a different plan or what would be the best course of action as well.
So, our tip here was get it off your chest. I mean, don't bottle it up. You're frustrated. It sucks when things like this happen, but get it off your chest and then quickly pivot into, all right, what am I going to do to turn this into something good, right? It may not be something great that you had planned, but how do I keep it from just being rotten and salvage it and keep it in the realm of something that's good?
Yeah, that's true. And I just think back like to our Greece trip and that hotel that we ended up staying at, like having dinner there and having the mythos beer for the first time, and just like being introduced to that. That was like our first introduction to like Greek food. And it was like a little local place and, just little experiences like that. And like you said, going to Disneyland or just how can you make it into something? So if you're stuck somewhere, like, is there a way that we can make this work? Is there something, if you have kids with you, like where can we take them? Where, to like, just try to make this something fun instead of just staying frustrated and angry and turn it into a positive memory, I guess.
Yeah. And I think for me, growing up as a child, we flew standby, right? We were non-rev. My mom worked for the airlines and literally we would pack a bag, but sometimes we'd totally different clothes in that bag because we might be heading to one location and then you get there and then by the time you can get on the plane, all the seats fill up and so you're not going there anymore. But we didn't just go home. My mom just knew, like, she worked in reservations, so she knew every flight kind of in her head. And she's like, okay, well, we could probably go here. And so it was almost like taking a dart out and throwing it at a map and be like, let's try this instead. And so we went to a lot of different places than where we had intended. as a child growing up just because of that.
And I think that was your mindset too when you knew that we weren't going to make that flight to Brussels. It was like, okay, where else can we go? And then thankfully we were then in a place, London, where, London is always a good idea. So it's like, okay, what else can we do?
So we talked a little bit about travel insurance and, credit cards that have travel disruption in it, but it's not good enough to just have that. There's some tips that you need to give people that will help them.
Yeah, I think know what's covered. So try, as boring and unfun as that is from a travel perspective, right? It's not the fun part, but know what is covered, right? And then know what kind of documentation you're going to need. So if you have an emergency, even before you go and somebody gets sick, so just know, okay, if I'm at the doctor or whatever, what kind of paperwork do I need to get from them? If your flight is delayed, if your flight is canceled, if just be proactive to say, okay, how can I get this documented? What email do I need? What website do I need? Can I go ahead and put in a request for this kind of thing? And just be, asking questions. A lot of times, and I know that those insurance policies, those credit card things are cumbersome to read through, but they have, toll-free numbers and things like that. So just call and say, hey, asking questions. Hey, we might have this issue, but I just want to understand, what we need. I think the sooner that you can do that, because like I said, on the back end, it was difficult for me to online get the things that I needed. So just doing a little work up front to figure out what it is that you need.
And I think lastly, just the last tip that we'll throw in, if you have a tight layover in a airport or a town or something like that, you might want to think about proactively doing some research on that city or that area. Put a few pins on a Google map that if you were to get stuck there, you're not having to start from scratch. Where would I go? Where would I stay? What might I see there? Those type of things. So at least you can pull that up, and then be prepared to salvage the trip. It, might even help you to think about a new place that you want to go and visit that you hadn't ever thought about before, because it's in an area where you just would typically lay over.
Yeah, that's true. And you can turn into someday bucket list into, today bucket list, because they're a cancellation bucket list. That's true. That's a good thought. And, a lot of times, like you said, you could find something, near the airport to stay or just something convenient. But yeah, what would be fun things to do? So that's a great tip, Scott.
Well, our sincere hope is that none of you ever have to experience disruptions in your travels. We've shared a few examples of how we turn those potentially bad situations into something memorable, but we also recognize it adds a layer of stress into something that you had intended to be pleasure. We hope that these stories have helped give you a tool that will help you in the event that you experience an unexpected travel disruption. If you have a favorite story of how you turned a travel disruption into a great set of memories, we would love to hear it. Leave us a comment or drop us a note, as we are always inspired by your travel stories. Who knows, we might even want to share it in an upcoming episode.
We hope you enjoyed this episode and will find some inspiration to help you with your travel journeys. Please consider going on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. The more 5-star reviews we have, the more likely we are to be featured and discovered by others. Make sure to follow or subscribe to our podcast to be notified of new episodes when they are released. You can also find us on Instagram at Sunshine Travelers Podcast. Remember, that's Travelers with 1 L. And most importantly, share it with your friends and help them catch the travel bug. You never know, they may become your greatest travel companion.